the desert smiles. Madjid Abdellaziz has a vision, a green strip of life across the Algerian Sahara. And as is so often the case, great visions begin with small steps, little-noticed successes, and unconventional ideas that are at best smiled at by the prevailing dogma. If you look down on the region from an altitude of 2 or 3 kilometers, you might think the desert is smiling. The contours of the mouth, some also see an eye in it, are formed by a narrow mountain ridge, which thereby shapes the area into a flat bowl. Just a few years ago, the desert here was as brown as the land surrounding it, in the middle of the Algerian Sahara, a barren, stony patch tyrannized by the sun. Jim Morrison could have drawn inspiration for his legendary song The End here, but in the midst of this desolation, a green patch slowly began to emerge in 2006. Starting with small pale dots, these grew larger with each year, grew together, and became darker and richer. Today, long rows of lettuce beds and potatoes shine in summer, and in between, fruit trees stretch their still thin branches towards the sky, where a few cumulus clouds drift leisurely. Besides the hundreds of apple trees, there are also pear, apricot, fig, lemon, orange, and olive trees, a total of almost 3,000. The wondrous new oasis is called Djanan. This is Arabic and means something like garden. It can also be the current state of affairs. This is partly because, apart from the fields and flower beds, there is little more than a kind of barn without a roof and a 1.5-meter high concrete water basin next to it. This, however, is hardly inviting for a swim because a tube in the middle juts up into the sky. It is also connected by a bundle of arm-thick metal hoses to a construction reminiscent of a cannon from the post-apocalyptic Mad Max films. This is supposed to be the technology of the future? Madjid Abdellaziz laughs. We rarely need the cloudbuster anymore, and soon the roof will be on top. Inshallah, God willing. The small, full-figured Algerian with the somewhat graying mustache is not the inventor of the monster, but he built it and with its help became the founder of the green miracle in the desert. Madjid Abdellaziz is actually an engineer for refrigeration technology, studied in Germany, and worked for a long time as a project engineer and project manager for large companies. Later, he trained as a software specialist, and if he hadn't been given a second life in 1994, he might still be doing it. It was a trip with 2 helicopters of the Algerian army. A few entrepreneurs and their relatives had wanted to get an idea of the tourist potential of the desert. The return flight was scheduled, and the group climbed into the first helicopter, in which Madjid was also supposed to fly. But Madjid was late, and so the aircraft took off without him, only to spin out and crash shortly afterwards. Almost all of the 15 passengers died in the flames. Allah spared you because the desert still needs you, a local Tuareg told him. Madjid Abdellaziz did not want to believe him, but when he attended a lecture by Bernd Senf a few years later, he remembered these words. Bernd Senf is a professor at the Berlin School of Economics and Law, where he actually teaches economics. On that day, he spoke about a topic that made many of his colleagues raise their eyebrows: Wilhelm Reich and his life energy concept. The Conservative from 1968. Senf had come across the famous Freud student through his preoccupation with psychoanalysis and social theories, and since, as an economist, he was hardly influenced by the verdicts of the natural sciences, he had taken Reich's controversial life energy theories seriously. His interest was strengthened all the more when his attention was later drawn to Viktor Schauberger, who at about the same time, in the 1930s to 1950s, had come to similar conclusions in a completely different way. "You are moving wrongly," he had succinctly summarized his findings. For the Austrian forester and natural scientist, it was intuitively obvious that in addition to the four so-called physical basic forces, which are only model components anyway, there is another force, or an active principle in nature, that had been excluded from scientific descriptions because people thought they could do without it. Reich called this force, which can also be called energy, organ. In China, it is called qi or qi. For the Hindus, it is prana, and the Germanic tribes called it vril. Today, it is slowly gaining a foothold again in modern natural sciences. However, one does not speak of organ or prana, but calls the principal emergence or self-organization. Biones. The visionary researcher discovered his organ at the end of the 1930s by observing the formation of single-celled organisms in a biological colloid. There, it appeared under the microscope as a pulsation of small bubbles radiating a bluish light. These bubbles, from which, according to his observation, the unicellular organisms are formed by contraction and compression, represented for him a kind of biological quantum. Reich created the beautiful term biones for them and tried to capture them in a metal box. To be on the safe side, he equipped the box with a second insulating layer of organic material. The whole thing worked, although differently than expected, because not only the box with the samples showed a temperature increase inside, but also an empty box standing next to it. It took Reich a while to understand what was going on. Obviously, organic materials attracted this energy, while metals could keep it out or reflect it. The insight soon gave rise to the legendary organ accumulator, a kind of mini cupboard into which one sits to recharge one's batteries, or, for example, to accelerate healing processes. This energy seemed to be everywhere, even in cellars or at extremely low temperatures, where Reich still saw its movement as heat wave-like flickering under certain conditions. He also saw scattered light and the occasional static electricity that occurs in nature as aspects of organ energy. According to his observations, there are also large-scale directional movements in the atmosphere that run from west to east in the form of waves and vortices. For him, the blue of the sky was less an atmospheric effect than a sign of his life energy that animates the planet. In order to obtain confirmation for his discovery from the scientific establishment, Reich approached the leading figure of the time in 1941, Albert Einstein. Einstein received him, and they spent half a day discussing the observed phenomenon of the temperature increase in the accumulator boxes. When they parted, they agreed that further research was necessary. But a few days later, Einstein declared that the experimental observations were only an effect of heat convection and refused to support them. Life energy had thus once again fallen through the cracks of the mainstream. Whether Einstein was right or radiation is an independent energetic process is still not entirely clear. What is known, however, is that the Grand Master of Physics was by no means the noble, objective scientist that the media still portray him as today. The results of extensive and careful observations of the temperature differences in the organ accumulators, which John J. Tretton and other comrades in arms of his Organ Institute carried out between 1995 and 2008, speak against Einstein's view and that of established physics. However, these results, which contradict the second law of thermodynamics, have not yet been confirmed by other researchers. In the 1980s, the German quantum physicist Fritz Albert Popp demonstrated for the first time with a highly sensitive photomultiplier that living cells emit photons in the wavelengths of visible light. However, these biophotons, as Popp calls them, cannot be identical to the radiation observed by Reich because the light emission from the cells is too weak for the receptors of the human visual apparatus. Of course, this does not rule out the possibility that there is a connection. But what is this bluish light that also shows up as a ring of steel around living erythrocytes? As in the case of the strange temperature increase in the organ accumulators, mainstream science has a simple answer: a light refraction effect. Despite the rejection, Reich continued his research. In 1944, he succeeded in exciting organ energy by means of high voltage and enlightening up a 60-watt light bulb with the resulting electrical discharge pulses. Organ and electricity are thus closely coupled, as also shown by thunderstorms, which he regarded as discharge processes in an atmosphere that is too strongly charged by organ. A healthy system seems to be characterized by the fact that the energy in it can flow freely. If this is not the case, organ accumulates and solidification and standstill occur. Reich called this deadly organ, or door for short. Such a door atmosphere is not only characterized by stagnation, but the tension that builds up as a result is also regularly discharged in violent energetic outbursts in the form of storms and other freak weather. Ether, God, and Devil. This concept can also be transferred to the human system, in which Reich now saw diseases as a disturbance of the flow of life energy, a concept that is also used in many Asian traditions. In this context, it should not be forgotten that such life-energetic concepts usually refer to levels of observation and effect that are very difficult, if not impossible, to access metrologically. Organ, prana, and chi are indeed observable and measurable, but only indirectly, through various forms of expression as an increase in temperature or, more rarely, radiation. Their absence, in turn, causes symptoms that correspond to the various diseases, in humans as well as in nature, where blockages first show up as a decline in the growth of vegetation and a decrease in the diversity of species. If the blockage is so strong that the self-regulating forces can no longer take effect, the process of decay continues. We then call the end either death or desert. With his view of the Earth as a living organism permeated and driven by a universal energy, Reich preceded the later Gaia hypothesis by a good 2 decades, with which the American biophysicist James Lovelock became famous in the mid-1960s. A key role for Reich was played by vortex structures. While in the human body, they act more in subtle form as chakras, on the larger scale of the Earth, they appear more visibly and perceptibly, in the atmosphere for example, as low-pressure vortices. These vortices, as one of many mechanisms, are a driving force of weather events and thus maintain the life energy flow within the organism Earth on this level. In his book, Ether, God, and Devil, Cosmic Superposition, he formulated his thesis. Everything moves in spirals or vortices. Gravity is the pull or movement of organ energy towards the vortex center. Matter is condensed energy. Organ energy attracts more organ energy. Planets are condensed organ energy. As they attract more and more of it, they grow. The same is true of solar systems, galaxies, and all other cosmic structures. In the sky, living events express themselves in the form of cumulus and similar cloud shapes, which he also regarded as energy condensations, although they do not show vortex shapes. In contrast, a door atmosphere tended to show up as either an undifferentiated cloud layer or a glistening cloudless sky. A device that still bears the misleading name Cloudbuster helped against both. For unlike the name suggests, no clouds are cracked or dissolved, but only a suction is generated that brings movement back into the solidified system. Today, some users therefore prefer to call the device Doorbuster. As is so often the case with great researchers, The idea for this came from a mixture of chance, close observation, and an open mind. The principle behind it is as simple as the construction. Water attracts organ, and in order for this attraction to be strong and targeted enough, it must be 1. Focused, and 2. The water must flow. The focusing is done by metal tubes pointing in the appropriate direction and connected to the water by metal hoses. Therefore, a doorbuster resembles a multi-barreled anti-aircraft gun rather than a device that is able to get the flow of life flowing again. After the first attempts in Reich's home state of Maine, in the northeast of the USA, proved promising, he ventured into the desert in Arizona. After initial problems, he succeeded there too, in stimulating the deadly organ in the atmosphere, and thus breaking it down. The result? The prairie grass in the desert around Tucson, which was actually only centimeters high, had grown to about 30 centimeters after a few weeks. A few years later, by order of a US court, all of Wilhelm Reich's books containing the term organ or referring to it were burned. In addition, the ingenious researcher was sentenced to 2 years in prison for disobeying a court order. There, he died of a heart attack in 1957 at the age of 60. There was no autopsy of the body. Djanan. Reich has successors, not only as a researcher and pioneer in medicine and in the field of psychotherapy. His celestial acupuncture, which actually is aimed at the earth, is also being continued. In Germany by Bernd Senf, in the USA, for example, by James de Meo, a geographer who proved in his dissertation that the replacement of peaceful matriarchal societies with patriarchy 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in large parts of Africa and Asia was essentially caused by desertification in these regions. His thesis fit very well with those of Reich on the connection between regressive forms of society and what he calls character armoring. De Meo is not just a theorist, however. Drawing on cloudbuster technologies, he began working in Israel in the early 1990s. Followed in 1994 by a large multi-year project in northeastern Africa, which has been plagued by years of drought. Bernd Senf, who visited De Meo in Eritrea at the time, reports, "When we arrived in Eritrea, the country was completely parched by a drought that had been intensifying for 15 years, but the first rains began just 2 hours after the start of celestial acupuncture. When I visited Eritrea again in 1997, the previously arid land was covered with lush green meadows and fields of grain and vegetables, and the previously dry rivers and lakes were again abundantly filled with water. Moreover, the previously dull atmosphere and landscape had cleared up and seemed refreshing instead of oppressive and paralyzing as before." Here you see the doer and initiator Madjid Abdellaziz in the summer of 2009. The beautiful cumulus clouds above him would have been impossible a few years earlier. For Madjid Abdellaziz, Senf's lecture in Berlin was both a revelation and a challenge, for the climatic conditions in his home country Algeria were not much better than those in Eritrea. In 2003, the Algerian government even considered importing drinking water in tankers. But before he could point his doorbuster skywards in the Sahara, several years were to pass. Besides the ongoing civil war, it was also the idea of a real desert greening that took a lot of time because he needed land for it. And for land, you need money and permits, and anyway. After much toiling and froing, the time finally came in 2005, not least thanks to the demanding support of his wife Maya, a doctor practicing in Berlin. The two named the land for which they were able to acquire the right of use Djanan. Flat coils and standing waves. To turn a stony, dusty wasteland that the sun heats up to 45 degrees into a garden, however, it is not enough to simply set up a door or cloudbuster and plant a few trees. That much was clear to Madjid. This is where a second researcher and inventor comes into play, Viktor Schauberger, who, like Reich, excelled in the precise observation of nature. The Austrian forester was particularly fond of water, to which he devoted his attention again and again during his foraging expeditions through the forests and meadows. In particular, he noticed that trout are apparently capable of feats that biomechanically should not be possible at all, such as lightning-like acceleration against the current or high jumps over what are actually insurmountable rapids. Schauberger's insight: it is vortices that enable fish to do this. Vortices in the water and vortices in the gills. They are also what give water, like the atmosphere, vitality. But since vortices do not only play such a significant role in water, but can be found everywhere in nature, the vortex was a kind of energetic primal principle for Schauberger. Independently of this, however, water also exhibits a number of other unusual properties, which are referred to in science as anomalies. Some scientists have counted 40 of them. What causes these anomalies and why they exist at all is largely unclear. An excerpt from the list. Water is the only substance known to us that exists in nature in all states of matter. From a chemical point of view, water should actually be gaseous, but it has a density 2,000 times greater than it should, according to the periodic table. Water expands when it freezes, something that only the metals gallium and bismuth do. It reaches its greatest density already at 4 degrees Celsius. That's why ice floats on top. Compared to other substances, water has a fairly high specific heat capacity, which means it can absorb a lot of energy without the temperature increasing significantly. This keeps the temperature difference between summer and winter on Earth bearable for humans. If the oceans were made of oil, a summer day in Europe would be 50 to 60 degrees warm, while in winter we would have Arctic temperatures. At 37 degrees Celsius, the amount of energy needed to change the temperature is greatest, which ensures a stable body temperature for humans. The vaporization temperature of water is much higher than the vaporization temperature of other liquids. As with Reich's discoveries, all kinds of myths and unanswered questions surround Schauberger's research and inventions. It is undisputed that he worked as a conscript in the years of the Second World War on flying discs that used the vortex principle as propulsion. First attempts were successful, at least in the sense that the devices, which were barely a meter in size, took off with enormous acceleration, as eyewitnesses reported. However, they could not yet be steered. Further development was prevented by the end of the war and the collapse of Germany. After the war, Schauberger concentrated on the development of small power stations that drew their power from the self-acceleration of water vortices. He died in 1958 after US investors had used tricks to seize his research results, including the functional models. For Abdellaziz, Schauberger's findings on water are just as important as Reich's, but he also obtained a third source of knowledge. He also brought a third mastermind and intellectual supporter on board, Nikola Tesla. The Serbo-Croatian American is considered one of the founders of modern electrical engineering due to his invention of alternating current. One of his frequently used elements in the experiments for energy generation and transmission was the flat coil, which can also be seen as a two-dimensional vortex. A passive flat coil, through which no current flows, can be used as an antenna. From a conventional point of view, it receives normal electromagnetic radiation. From an extended unconventional point of view, due to its shape and material, it couples by resonance to other energy fields or to field components of the electromagnetic spectrum that are not described by the established models. An example of this is the longitudinal oscillation component of the electromagnetic fields, the so-called scalar wave, which was still taken into account by Maxwell in the first versions of his formulae of 1864. but was later discarded as meaningless in the modifications and new versions of Maxwell's equations. The assumption is that this was a mistake. Newer models, which in turn build on old ones, identify the longitudinal waves of the EM waves with the neutrinos and consider them to be ring vortices, an idea that goes back to Lord Kelvin and Hermann von Helmholtz. Since their vortex model at the time required a mechanical ether, it could not succeed. Whether and how the spiral flat coil interacts with vortex structures on the atomic or even quantum level due to its shape is currently largely unknown. At least it is conceivable. And it is thus also conceivable that a flat coil contributes to changing the properties of water in such a way that it can be described as energetically charged. In doing so, the effect could even be greater than that of energizing through mechanical turbulence, often referred to as levitation. In any case, in combination with other methods, it leads in Djanan to the fact that the stagnant water of the approximately 5 by 5 meter concrete basin that Abdellaziz built became flowing, i.e., living water. Another explanatory model for water energization, which is at least partially in line with school physics, states that the hydrogen bonds in the molecule use part of their bonding energy for a connection to the outside. This creates loose and very short-lived bonds to neighboring molecules, a kind of non-binding handshake with colleagues, so to speak. The resulting structures are called clusters. In principle, these clusters disintegrate again immediately, but if there are foreign substances dissolved in the water between the molecules, they naturally ensure that the next cluster structure is the same or similar. With regard to the storage capacity of information, there's the assumption that such imprints remain even when the substances dissolved in the water have long since disappeared. This model is often used by homeopathy to explain the effect of high potencies in which, statistically speaking, no molecules of the active ingredient are present. On this molecular level, energization means that either the imprinted cluster patterns are erased again, or that cluster structures are created that give the water special properties. The simplest method of erasing old imprint is turbulence, which nature does all the time. Another possibility is electromagnetic fields in the broadest sense, which of course can also imprint, although their mode of action is still poorly understood. In addition to the flat coil in the bottom of the pool, from which a vertical antenna projects upwards in the middle, there are 4 perforated steel tubes connected to each other by a metal conductor in the corners of the pool. One of the tasks of the entire construction is to create a vortex structure on a molecular level, i.e., no visible vortex. The fact that water molecules are electromagnetic dipoles that align themselves accordingly in corresponding fields certainly plays a role here. If all components are coordinated with each other, this invisible vortex turns ordinary water into superionized water in a certain sense, as Abdellaziz calls it. However, this superionization is not to be understood literally, nor does it have anything to do with the alleged miracle water of the same name by the Turk Ayhan Doyak, which has been haunting the esoteric scene for about 10 years. If one believes the corresponding reports on the internet, Doyak has meanwhile also been exposed as a fraud. In any case, with the superionized water according to the Algerian recipe, the pool becomes a powerful counter-vortex, which is connected to the door-solidified atmosphere for a certain time via the tube antennas. The tubes are nothing other than extremely curved parabolic mirrors. Only it is not TV or radio signals that are received, but the deadly organ. It's like in humans, where you dissipate pent-up energy via certain points, Abdellaziz explains. To prevent the system from tipping back into its old state after the initial successes, a permanently acting cloud stabilizer was also used, which works according to the same principle as the cloudbuster, only in a more restrained way. The coupling with the correspondence fields in the atmosphere then possibly takes place through standing waves that form in the tubes. Since standing waves are resonance phenomena, the material of the tubes also plays a role. Steel, or actually iron, is said to be more suitable than copper in this case. The weather forecaster compares the functioning of his technology with that of the pyramids. The Egyptian Great Pyramid, he is sure, was by no means a tomb, but rather, at least also, a gigantic weather machine, for which there is some evidence. The fact that this works excellently on a small scale was demonstrated just 1 hour after the first trial operation of the door cluster in Djanan on July 7, 2005. After 1 hour, it began to get cooler. 3 hours later, the first drops fell, and a few days later, there were violent thunderstorms, always a sign that a lot of tension is being released. The next day, the inhabitants of the town of El Hoita, about 10 kilometers away, were able to admire cumulus clouds in the sky for the first time in many years. Integral environmental healing. Because the technology is so powerful, Abdellaziz also exercises restraint when it comes to technical details. It is true that the possibilities are still very limited, because even the best doorbuster can do little more than stimulate the self-regulating mechanisms of the system. But on the other hand, prolonged actions can disrupt this natural flow equilibrium just as much. That is why Abdellaziz is rather critical of the efforts of his colleagues from such initiatives as Organize Africa and Organize Germany. Their activists try to influence the weather, electromagnetic fields, electrosmog, or the so-called chemtrails with variations of devices. These so-called orgonite generators are available as cloudbuster versions, with and without tubes. They were invented around the turn of the millennium by Don Croft, an American who sees himself as an etheric warrior and therefore calls one type of his generators holy hand grenades. On the Organize Africa website, orgonite is seen as the stone in David's sling that could really bring Goliath down. Orgonite is said not only to influence the weather, but also to clear the mind and detoxify the body, which is entirely in line with Wilhelm Reich's views. Unlike the classic cloudbusters, which are usually only used for a few days and a few times a year, the holy hand grenades have a permanent effect because they are buried somewhere, if they actually work. William Thomas, who is considered one of the first to expose the controversial chemtrails, says, however, at least with regard to the effects against the evil contrails, no, they don't. Among other things, the effect is doubtful because they are earthed with a mixture of metal chips and semi-precious stones in a synthetic resin block, instead of living water. Whether the effect of the cloudbusters equipped with tubes is better than the classic variant that uses water as the pole of attraction is not clear at present. At the very least, numerous episodic reports suggest that there are weather and other effects. Since their mode of action, like that of Reich's cloudbusters, is at best theoretical, one should refrain from installing them permanently to be on the safe side, says Madjid Abdellaziz, especially if they are also buried en masse and undocumented. Instead of permanently interfering with nature with man-made technologies, the primary goal is integral environmental healing, and this happens neither through artificial irrigation nor through weather manipulation, but by gently and purposefully stimulating nature to do what it cannot do without help. For example, to form clouds, he explains. Real healing, then, happens by restarting the natural cycles, which may well include economic cycles. Finally, For the German Algerian, the methodological apparatus of integral environmental healing also includes an old Indian technology from the Vedic tradition called Homa or Agnihotra, a fire ritual performed at sunrise and sunset. While a special mantra is recited, dried cow dung is burnt together with ghee, the oil of clarified butter, in a pyramid-shaped copper vessel the size of a flower pot. The ashes are then scattered in the field, and since the quantity of ashes hardly exceeds a handful, it is easy to see that the mechanism of action cannot be a chemical-physical one, but a subtle one, in modern terminology, an informational one. Analogous to homeopathy. The first apples. The rest is quick to tell. After the first cloudbuster operations were successful, planting began. In January 2006, the next operation took place, during which the temperature dropped by 5 degrees within 2 hours, and soon after, well-formed cumulus clouds formed again. In September 2006, the first 3 apples were ripe. In July 2007, the first grapes. In 2008, 40 kilos of potatoes planted had grown to about 10 times that amount. In the entire region, the climate has changed so much that Kalahari truffles are growing in the desert again as they used to, an event that even made it into the German Tagesschau as news. The blossoming landscapes, they are coming, in the Sahara. The Tagesschau presenter opened the film report, only to then not mention the visionary initiator with a single word. The climate has changed so much in the entire region that Kalahari truffles are growing in the desert again as they used to. More significant than truffles are other results, such as the fact that Algeria had a record grain harvest in 2009. It looks similar for 2010. Whether such successes are caused by climate change in an area of only a few thousand square kilometers is, of course, an open question. However, at least a connection with the newly created lakes and refilled dams in the Bosel region, about 300 kilometers north of Djanan, can be considered very likely. According to plans, a zero-emission city is to be built there, with the participation of German companies. But so far, the project has made only halting progress, partly due to the lack of water. Now, there is new hope. Djanan also inspires hope because Madjid has another vision, that of a green belt running from west to east across Africa. This wave, as he calls the project, which is currently little more than a bold thought, could become a kind of catch basin for refugees from the interior of the continent on their way to Europe. Instead of languishing there as illegal and underpaid laborers on the crumbs of Western affluent societies, they could learn the methods of integral environmental healing in the oasis of such a belt, and then implement the knowledge in their home regions. However, this is still a long way off. In addition to the roof on the only building, accommodation for other families in Djanan is still missing. At the moment, only 2 families and a few helpers are taking care of the fields. In the long term, the site should be able to feed about 30 families, or 150 to 200 people. For housing, an architecture made of earth bags is planned, a construction method that is very popular in development projects in Africa because of its ease of use and low costs. The polypropylene grain sacks used worldwide are filled with the earth material available on site and stacked on top of each other. Barbed wire between the layers provides support and stability. The walls are then plastered. The plaster base is usually wire mesh or other netting. With a little knowledge and a feeling for statistics, there are hardly any limits to the architectural imagination. A German architectural firm has begun with corresponding designs. A first step towards supporting the vision of many green islands that connect to form a green wave across Africa can be taken by sponsoring a tree in Djanan. Of course, other donations are also welcome. Remarkably, the Arabic term Djanan also points the way to how healing in the most comprehensive sense of the word can happen, indeed must happen. For such comprehensive healing, the creation of the oasis can be a first step, but it is not enough. As an Arabic word, Djanan is derived from the Sanskrit word jhana, which is usually simply translated as knowledge, but actually means something more like higher knowledge. In German, there is the term gnosis, which comes from ancient Greek and is also derived from jhana. However, this higher knowledge is not knowledge that the intellect can attain, but the living experience that everything is one. In the spiritual traditions of the East, this is called self-realization. It is the space that one becomes beyond the I, and from whose non-perspective, this I exposes itself as an unreal construct that acts like a barrier. If this blockage is dissolved, one ends up, often with a smile, in Djanan.